Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I can see everyone's gradually arriving in, and welcome to this Tuesday online seminar. And this afternoon, we are discussing the impact of COVID-19 on the property market. We have a panel of contributors, starting with our own Michael Shapiro, who is a partner at Shemmings and head of the property team. We're also lucky enough to be joined by two guest speakers sharing their expertise with us. We have Phil Richards, who's going to be talking to us about sort of the commercial side of things. He's a chartered surveyor and works for Brecker, Grossmith. And we're also joined by Andy Noton, Andy's part of Lubbock Fine. He's part of the property advisory group dedicated to looking after real estate and related businesses. Sorry, I should have said Phil is head of professional services. My apologies, Phil. So the guys are all going to talk about their impression of the impact of COVID-19 from their specific sectors. And then at the end, they'll be taking the questions that you might like to put to them. So if you can use the Q&A facility during this, and what we'll do at the end is I'll hand the questions over to the guys individually. So please keep your questions to the end or put them on the Q&A panel during the session. So without any further ado, I will hand over to Mr. Shapiro. Michael, the court is yours.
Hello. Afternoon, everyone. I'm Michael Shapiro. And firstly, I'm delighted to welcome Phil Richards, who I've known for around 10 years, and Andy Noton, who I've known for around 5 years, to join our panel this afternoon. So here we are on day 86 of the lockdown. Well, 86, whoever thought that we would be working from home for 86 days and who knows how many more. So the future has arrived a little faster and a little sooner than expected. Undoubtedly, it's had an impact. Lawyers particularly have rapidly changed the way they work. Working from home is here to stay. And in a crisis, lawyers can move rapidly. And we have moved with agility as well. There are a number of legal and market-driven impacts which the COVID-19 crisis has had on property lawyers. And in no particular order, I'll start with one of the matters that many clients of mine said in the first week of lockdown: how are we going to complete if we can't come to your office to sign documents? Dead easy. Electronic signatures. They were permitted pre-COVID, and now they're used much wider and much more regularly. And then people said, but how are we going to get the documents to you, and how will you get them to the other solicitors? Again, easy. Scanner. Scanned documents are now used to complete. We have wet ink signature documents, normally with an undertaking to say we will hand them over when it is practicable to do so. That's worked. The next thing was identity. What if my bank needs you to certify my identity? Or I open a new file and my compliance officer says, can't do any work until you verify who it is. Again, easy. The land registry and therefore most compliance officers in law firms will accept identity by way of video. It's very easy. The client holds up a WhatsApp. I look at it, they look at it with their passport, I take a screenshot and we put it on the file. So, what else has happened in the law? Well, firstly, you will all remember that just after lockdown was the March quarter day. So there were the rents were due. Would rents be reduced? Would clients not pay? Would everybody just take a blind eye? Well, possibly all of those, and I'm sure Phil, when he talks more about the market, will be discussing that. What tenants need to realise is they can't claim by right a reduction. There's no statutory right to say, well, I can't use my premises, you're not providing the service or whatever. There are very few leases that have what's called a force majeure clause, which normally says rent will be abated until the force majeure has ceased. Very few leases have that. So all obligations in leases are not automatically suspended. So what tenants need to do is to negotiate, speak to your landlords, don't just say, sorry, mate, I'm not paying, but actually discuss, because most landlords will suspend any rent arrears. And do remember, they are rent arrears, not a rent-free period, or they'll give a rent holiday, or they will spread repayment of the rent over a period of, say, 12 months. Many of you will be aware of something called CRA, which is the Commercial Rent Arrears Recovery Scheme. The minimum amount of net unpaid rent required before it can be exercised has been increased to an amount equal to 90 days. And of course, most of you will be aware of the temporary halt on the use of statutory demands and winding up petitions where a company's been unable to pay their rent because of COVID. And there is talk of this being extended. So what else is happening in the property world? Well, Phil will be talking much more on the impact on the commercial office lettings market. I know from one client, they told me they managed to collect 2/3 of their rents that were due for the March quarter, and their cash flows are planning on 50% being collected for next week. But that's only one client, and be interesting to see what tenants do. And practically, I found leases are being rejigged. I've become much more of an advisory lawyer, although I have completed a lot of transactions recently. Reversion releases are being issued, longer term for a rent holiday, break clauses, downsizing. And I'll be talking about this in more detail because I know that there was a question submitted before this started on this. We've then got the residential housing market. That opened a month ago. The new build market, firstly. We act for a lot of buyers of plots, particularly overseas investors who maybe buy 2 or 3 plots in new residential build for investment. We were having a lot of difficulty earlier in the year because completion took place, but the clients weren't able to deal with documentation or they weren't able to get their loan in place. Valuers are now allowed to go in, so buyers can complete. Notices to complete are in the main being extended by developers' solicitors, so our plot sales team at the moment are really busy. Some house builders will say that their site reservations have gone down. Others are seeing a rise now, but that's a side of the market now that the construction industry is started to go back to work again that's expected to start building up again. One of the problems first-time buyers are having is because of a shrinking pool of mortgages with cheap rates and risk-averse banks, there's actually not that much money being loaned. It was interesting to read last week a statistic, the first week in June, the average rental increase, the average housing interest increase, people making genuine inquiries, was 137% on average, mainly due to pent-up demand and possibly trading up because people working from home felt they needed more space. There was a lot of publicity about the housing market, and I actually spoke to a good friend of mine who runs the leading agency in St John's Wood, Mark Pollock at Aston Chase, and he told me he was pleasantly surprised that the lockdown, and he said the lockdown, I'm just quoting from his email, the lockdown has been really defining because people are in their homes. They either love them or loathe them. And I gather deals are being done. The rental market is stronger. There is limited stock. There are some good quality properties, and there are people who want to move. Now, Phil's going to talk much more about the commercial property sector. But one thing that I have noticed and read in the papers and the sort of property press is that overseas investors are starting to return. A Canadian group last week bought 7.3% of British land. Some people say commercial property might be undervalued, others say it's overvalued. Who knows? Can developers and landlords let the stock they've got? Are tenants going to be trading down? Great time for the opportunistic or the cash buyers, I think. The city as a square mile and a world centre, A recent business index published last week said it was the most attractive business district in the world. But will it remain so after this? Who knows? But the good news is Brexit does not seem to have led to an outflow. We now come to retailers. Of course, many of them have sadly gone under over the last few months, and this was something that was pre-COVID, and a lot of them are using CVAs as weapons. CVAs are a very good tool with a landlord, to get a landlord to reduce the rent, because basically you say, I want less rent, or I will put my business into administration and liquidation. This is sensible and not sensible, depending whether you're acting for a landlord or a tenant. I read the other day that Travelodge are looking at doing a CVA restructuring this week. They lease approximately 560 hotels, and the article said that if their plan is rejected, then there's the threat of administration or liquidation, which leads to the possible losses of 11,000 jobs. Not something we want to read about. And they're looking to get their rents cut by up to a third. TM Lewin, the shop that most of us go to when we work in the office so that we look relatively smart, was recently sold. Their new owners are planning to shut most of the stores. There was something in the paper yesterday. They have threatened a pre-pack unless the landlords agree to large rent cuts. But there is some good news. I read that Goldman Sachs have invested for a client around £3 billion over the next 7 years by backing a client in the retirement homes and general retirement villages, and they're looking for 10 more sites. It's not all doom and gloom, but it has, I found the last few months have been really interesting. And it's probably the first time that friends of mine have been starting to talk about the property market because it's featured so highly. I think, in conclusion, there's likely to be a battle next week after the June quarter day because tenants, of course, have not been trading over the last quarter. And then there are people who will refuse to pay because they've had no occupancy, no services. But are they using this as an excuse to get out of onerous leases? Who knows? Anyway, I'm now pleased to hand over to Phil.
Michael, thank you. And thank you for inviting me to join this webinar. As a real estate practitioner, I'm beginning to see an immediate impact that COVID is having on real estate. During the past 3 months of lockdown, we have all had to adjust to new or different normal circumstances. I bet many of you listening today have had to become accustomed to change recently. Of course, change can be a good thing, but when change comes, there is also uncertainty. And I think this is the issue that causes the most problems. As we don't quite know the full impact of the virus as yet, there is a strong probability that there will be a fundamental impact on the real estate sector. Whilst I don't proclaim to have all the answers, I want to spend a few moments talking about 3 areas of real estate where the impact is likely to have the largest effect: landlords, tenants, landlords. When the pandemic started to take hold in the UK and the government introduced lockdown restrictions to control the virus and save lives, the way we work and live changed almost overnight. Offices and shops up and down the country became empty as home working practices were almost universally adopted. From my own experience with this sudden change came a flood of requests to landlords from their tenants asking for assistance with rent and service charge payments. Each landlord has had to respond in their own way. Some have been generous, primarily for reputational reasons, such as the Crown Estate, Shaftesbury and others, and have offered rent waivers or deferment plans, while others have been less generous as they are concerned about their own financial positions and worried how they're going to meet their own financial commitments and obligations. As the virus does not discriminate, we are seeing that some landlords are feeling as much pain as their tenants. And I just wonder how long some landlords will be able to offer support packages to their tenants if there is a sustained or lasting impact on the economy. Tenants. As with most things in life, the virus has showed us that there are winners and losers. Some business sectors have without doubt felt the full financial impact of the virus, while others have not been affected so much. From my own experience, restaurants, gyms and leisure operators will all see a different landscape post-lockdown. The firm I work for manages properties in London, where many of the tenants are small businesses in the restaurant and food sectors. These businesses have been hit hard, and many people who have put their heart and soul into making businesses work have seen revenues reduced to nothing overnight. However, as a nation, we are proud of our resilience and ability to respond with confidence after adversity. Although the business landscape will be different in the future, and there will be challenges surrounding social distances to cope with, I'm confident that some businesses will survive and come through this crisis in some shape or form. Buildings. A massive part of the government's plan to beat the virus has centred on social distancing, and I think this will have the greatest impact on buildings and our traditional working environments. Large office places may have to be reconfigured to reduce the density of people to allow for social distancing in the workplace. Occupiers looking for space may well decide to reduce their size requirements as more people continue to work from home. Research to substantiate this suggests that 63% of occupiers seeking office space expect occupied densities in offices to decrease. This may also impact the way buildings in the future are designed, and I'm certain that issues surrounding safety, hygiene, and employee well-being, which are already prominent in the workplace at present, will become even more important after this crisis. The way we access buildings, for example, will also potentially need to change. And according to research undertaken by Savills, contactless design in buildings, for example in appliances and lifts and doors, is expected to increase by 87%. So in conclusion, COVID-19 has changed perceptions and attitudes of how people interact with each other, both in and out of the working environment. Traditional boundaries between homes and offices have become even more blurred as the office or shop has become vacant due to lockdown restrictions. And I think all sectors of the economy will feel the effect in the long term of enhanced sanitising regimes. Thank you. Andy, I'll pass over to yourself.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Phil. And thank you, Michael, for inviting me to speak at this webinar. And welcome to everybody that's joined us. I'm going to run through some of the financial and tax impacts of COVID-19 on the UK property market. Coming through. And although most of what I'll talk about isn't specifically property or tax related, because tax hasn't changed much in the last few weeks, and then I'm going to speculate on what the future might look like. For property companies, as Michael and Phil have both gone through, most of the initial impact of COVID-19 in the early days of lockdown was one of, as Michael and Phil both discussed in length, the non-payment of rent by tenants. Lockdown commenced just days before the March quarter rents were due, and this non-payment was across most sectors, but especially focused on retail and hospitality businesses. In addition, for property developers that we act for and construction companies, construction was halted or at least slowed on many sites, and this is particularly frustrating for a few clients that were only a short period away from practical completion on their buildings and realising their value. These impacts and others had knock-on impacts, so rent negotiations entered into privately, or as Michael mentioned, Travelodge quite publicly, between the landlord and the tenant, with plenty of press about renegotiations. Some landlords, as a result, have needed to defer the payment of loan interest because the rent didn't come in, so they couldn't pay the loan interest that was due. And in certain cases, and some quite public cases, they needed to arrange the waiving of loan covenant breaches. Following all this, the government stepped in with a range of measures, not specifically targeted at this property sector, but from which these businesses and businesses in all sectors could benefit. Firstly, the furlough scheme, which is a very well-known scheme. It's not a tax break as such, but it is monitored by the revenue. And it's been a method of retaining employment, and depending on your point of view, it's either preventing or deferring mass redundancies and unemployment. The latest figures are showing there's around about 9 million people now, 9 million employees have been furloughed over the life of this scheme, and it's expected to cost and has costed tens of billions to the UK Exchequer. The scheme is going to run to October 2020, but is going to be scaled back from July. And by the time it's closed, depending on any second wave of infection, the scheme will have run for 8 months. And I have to say this scheme and information about access to the scheme was probably the #1 query that my firm was dealing with in the immediate announcement of the lockdown. And it's what most clients were calling me about. How can I access this? What do I need to do? All the way through to the end of April. And we've been kept busy guiding clients through these complex rules and to be honest, ever-changing rules. Looking forward, though, it's hard to see how this scheme is going to get extended again, just because of its sheer cost. Next, for the property sector, the government introduced a business rates holiday for retail, hospitality, leisure businesses. The timing of the lockdown around the end of the 2020 rates year was useful because it allowed it to extend the business rates relief for the 2021 year, which is just about to start. And I have to say, the reopening of non-essential shops this week, and as we're discussing before the webinar, the future penciled in opening of hospitality businesses for early July is likely to be a pretty key driver on whether business rates are going to return and in what form. Because it's worth noting that business rates were under significant scrutiny before COVID-19, and I think COVID-19 is only going to accelerate those issues. Next, we have the Coronavirus Business Interruption Loan Scheme, CBILS, and related schemes for larger and much smaller businesses, and there were a headline announcement by the Chancellor as we went into lockdown. Under these schemes, large proportions of the loans are guaranteed by the government, and generally interest and fees are paid for the first 12 months. And despite a slow start, and there have been many revisions to the rules and guidance around these schemes, they've now provided funding to a large number of businesses. These loans generally haven't been of significant help to the property sector, certainly in the early days, as landlords tended to have assets on which security could be placed, and therefore borrowing under the rules and within the guidance was difficult. Construction companies, I know, have fared a lot better and been quite successful at raising these loans. And of course, tenants have raised these loans to make rent and service charge payments or not in many cases. Next measure that's introduced has been quite a few tax deferrals. So VAT falling due for payment between 20th of March, 30th of June has been deferred until 31st of March next year. And I know this measure certainly helped a number of property clients where the rent payments either didn't arrive or did arrive, but the client needs to build a fund or wishes to build a reserve of cash in case the June rent payments weren't late or they needed to renegotiate rents, etc. In addition, income tax due on the 31st of July can be deferred without interest or penalty for 6 months until 31st of January next year. And finally, on tax deferrals, HMRC have been far more accommodating in reaching time to pay arrangements. I mean, for our client base especially, we've had a number of these cases where we've been able to negotiate deals which we just simply wouldn't have dreamt about 6 months ago. But of course, all of these deferrals, whether they're tax deferrals, CBILS, etc., they're going to have to be repaid at some point. And the impact on cash flow come the early part of 2021, when a lot of these will come due for payment or clients will need to start making interest payments on their CBILS loans, is going to be quite significant about what happens. Finally, there's been other smaller measures, which I won't go into detail, things like grants for very small businesses by local authorities, changes to the statutory sick pay regime, and the self-employed income support scheme have also provided help to various businesses. But given all of this, the net result of all of this support by the government is that GDP still slumped, as we learnt yesterday, by 20% in April, and it's 25% down from its February high. And this, as Michael and Phil both mentioned, has mainly hit the retail and hospitality sectors, especially hard. But I doubt any sector is likely to emerge completely unscathed in some shape or form. And the government, with all this, have borrowed £62 billion in 1 month. The full impact of the property sector, I think, is only really going to be known once the smoke is cleared and the wider economy, and we know really what the route out of this crisis is. So looking forward, the $1 million question is, how are the government going to pay for all of this? And is it going to result in my business or my clients paying more tax? The short answer is quite clear. The government is going to enter into a hugely unprecedented level of borrowing to fund current expenditure, and we've seen figures of up to 300 billion in the current tax year is going to be borrowed by the government. And the last time we were using these words was sort of 10, 11 years ago in the midst of the financial crisis, which was then supposed to be a once in a lifetime event in terms of government borrowing. And here we are again, 10 years later. We all know the last financial crisis was followed by 10 years of austerity. And in that time, the government has still actually failed to balance the books and pay down any significant levels of debt. So I think beyond the immediate short term, the government's still going to have a large number of issues, because how are they going to let the economy grow back to its current level and withstand any significant cuts in government expenditure or raising of tax rates, not to mention the Brexit word. I expect there's going to be some fairly minor tinkering at the edges of taxation, things like, as was headlined by the Chancellor, the addressing disparities in rates of taxation for the self-employed and employed. I'm sure there'll be further tightening of taxation around large multinational corporations, Google and Apples of the world, but these tend to drive a lot more headlines than actual tax being raised. And again, the government might look at some tax reliefs, things like pension contributions. But it's worth noting that 75% of all taxes that are paid in the UK is income tax, national insurance and VAT. And for income tax, 30% of that is paid by the top 1% of all taxpayers. It was 20% of the top, what was paid by the top 1% in 2000. I think it's going to be difficult for governments to impose even more taxation on these individuals and for it actually to result in more tax being paid. These people are just too mobile and too able to structure their affairs and decide to go and work and live somewhere else in the world and earn what they earn. But having said all of that, I think the property sector has been particularly hard hit over the last 10 years, especially for non-resident investors. And I think it's unlikely, with the previous rises in FDLT, capital gains tax, the introduction of annual tax on envelope dwellings, finance cost relief restrictions for buy-to-let investors, I think it's unlikely there's going to be any future major property-focused tax-raising measures. And if anything, I think there might be some more reliefs in the property world to stimulate the housing market, which is bound to be sluggish coming out of this, and perhaps to stimulate the high street as more, like I mentioned earlier, perhaps business rates relief. So I think at the moment, to sort of summarise, I think it's all very uncertain at present. It's unlikely to be unclear until at least the next budget in the autumn. And I think at the moment, all we can all do is sit here and speculate about what the future and the post-COVID world is likely to look like. And with that, I'm going to hand back to Julie for some Q&A, I believe.
Lovely, thank you, gentlemen, for your expertise sharing there. And we've had some questions coming in, some of which I know you guys have answered via chat. There's one here for Andy. The impact of job losses on the property market. Will the RICS instruction not to down value due to COVID-19 be affected eventually by lack of affordability?
Well, I think there's a couple of bits within that question. I think the impact of job losses on the property sector really is about tenants and tenants losing their ability to pay the rent. And obviously, as tenants lose their ability to pay the rent, then those retailers and tenants, be they office occupiers or whatever they might be, are likely to end up being unable to pay their rent, defaulted on their leases, renegotiating. That's going to result in lower yields. And then I can't see how I mean, Phil will be the expert here, but I can't see how they can maintain pre-COVID valuations. I don't know, Phil, whether you want to add anything there on the valuation aspect.
Yes, I think that values will certainly have an interesting time assessing where the true value in properties lie, particularly if transactions are the number of volume of transactions is reduced. Obviously, because most valuations rely on evidence and to substantiate their values, and I think valuers will may find it quite tricky to, certainly with commercial rents, to question where the true rents lie at the moment.
Okay. We have another question in. Are there any thoughts on what stimulus packages the government is likely to implement to boost the property and retail sectors?
Okay, I could take a bit of that. As I mentioned in my talk, I think the business rates relief, I suspect that'll get extended or expanded. It was already pre-COVID was widely tipped. I think probably the biggest stimulus package, which while it won't be targeted at the property sector, will probably where it's going to have its biggest impact, and certainly did at the end of the last financial crisis, is quantitative easing by the Bank of England. They've already entered into unprecedented amounts of quantitative easing, and last time that resulted in asset price spikes and lower costs of borrowing. So they were my primary stimulus.
I'd like to chip in here. I think that with the certainly from the hospitality, pub and leisure operators that I've spoken to in the past, the issue of business rates will become even more under scrutiny after COVID. And I think that there'll be many commentators and practitioners clamoring for business rates restructuring in the long term to help ease the pressure on tenants, particularly in the hospitality and pub and retail sector.
Business rates have always been a bugbear. The number of clients I get who say to me, I can't believe what my rates are. So I suspect this is going to be a very good opportunity, a catalyst, if I was the government, to try and change the whole system.
Okay. More questions coming in, gentlemen. What do you think the impact will be like for office space in big cities and, on the other side, affordable housing?
I think in larger cities, demand for offices, well, it's interesting because the offices become a factor of production, and particularly large office buildings which are well designed, air conditioned, and where employee wellness and well-being is implemented into the design of these buildings. I think people will still need to go to work because it's a social interaction. Yes, it's all very well working from home, and flexible working practices are welcomed and are here to stay, certainly. But I think a lot of people like going to the office because it allows them to distance themselves from home. It allows them to interact with their colleagues in a more perhaps formal setting than a home study or a home spare room. And I think that there will be greater pressure, as I pointed out in my commentary, that people occupied densities may well reduce, but I think that there will still be demand for offices in big cities. The draw of the work environment will still be quite strong, and employers will still need people to go in to carry out their work functions.
Yeah. Okay, and leading on from that, another question, assuming a lot of commercial office buildings will be left empty as a lot of companies move operations to working from home, do you think, or do the panel think, that owning property is now a liability? What would the panel recommend portfolio owners do with empty stock?
That is the $1 million question. And I wouldn't like to answer that. But I was talking with a potential client a couple of weeks ago who is just about to start a refurbishment. And I said, are you going to do it? And he said, we are, because we reckon that there will be people, the smaller end of the market will go completely because 3 or 4 people in a firm can work from home. So what will happen is the next tier down will take the smaller offices, and then the people who say have 30 employees will go for a 20 desk space, and the people who have 300 or 400 will be going for the 100, 150 space. So there will certainly still be a demand and therefore a market, therefore an income in holding commercial property. The developments that I wonder about are some of these giant developments. There's one opposite our office being built at the moment, 22 Bishopsgate. You're nodding your head as well, because there is this massive, it's the largest constructed building in the city at the moment. They're providing services galore. I don't know what the rent is per square foot, but I bet the only way they're going to fill it is for it to go down. I may be wrong, but I think it'd be very interesting to see what is going to happen to some of these bigger buildings.
I think
serviced office market might improve.
I think the issue with the main thing I would comment here is that owning property, it's part of our DNA, it's part of our culture as an island nation. And I think an Englishman's home is his castle, and There will be landlords who want to continue to own buildings because it's good. They're tangible assets that you can see and you can touch and you can do things with. You can improve in good times. You can improve rents. You can asset management. You can change your tenants. You can review your leases. And I think that whilst there are clearly liabilities with owning property, where you've got empty stock, some landlords will think, will see this as a chance to consider the use of the building. Older buildings might well be suitable for redevelopment to housing. And I know that the government are very keen to try and improve the housing situation in this country. And so there may be a further relaxation of planning laws as previously to encourage people with older buildings to convert them to residential use or other uses, which may alleviate the housing issues and the supply of stock.
I think I'd add to that. You never know what, but owning a property is never really a liability, but it's what it's really worth. And it could be that it's not worth what it was worth 3 months ago, but there's plenty of people, and I've had plenty of discussions with potential clients who are looking to see this as an opportunity to buy, an opportunity to reposition. And you always look over the City of London over the last 50 years, it changes. What was unfashionable becomes fashionable, and uses change from commercial to residential, back to commercial, and who knows.
One of my shrewder investor clients, I was talking to him about this the other day. He said, I'll tell you what we're going into now are more sheds, distribution centres, but high-tech distribution centres, because you've only got to look how many white vans are delivering all the online shopping. The items have to come from somewhere, and I think people are going to keep on online shopping.
Okay, some interesting viewpoints there. We've had another question in. Over the past few years, I've found with my investor clients, retailers have had the upper hand in negotiating new leases. My clients don't want boarded up shops. Any thoughts on how that will pan out post-COVID?
I'll take a stab at answering this. I think certainly the market in general, office, retail and industrial, the tone of the market has swayed from being a landlord's market to very much a tenant's market. Particularly if there's going to be a large supply of surplus stock on the market that needs to be relet or got rid of. And I think tenants will have greater choice, particularly if they can negotiate better deals on rents because of a boom in supply. In London, I think that might be a little different because post-COVID, the conditions were pretty robust, demand was okay, and supply was fairly limited. So London, I think, will have a different picture altogether, but yes, I think it's much more of a tenant's market, and they will have the ability to choose, and if landlords want to get spaces let, they will have to listen to tenants' demands or tenants' requests for alternative lease terms or lower rents.
Or they are going to end up with boarded units. I think that some of the private shops and the one-off shops that have sprung up over the last few months, the sort of artisan shops or the shops, our local pub has started selling fresh fruit and veg from the bar. The people who run those, I am sure, will realise how successful they've been because of the good quality of their produce. Some of the high street you'll find gets taken over by individuals rather more than having yet another chain so that every high street looks the same. I think in 5 years the high street will look very different, and not every retail unit will be a retail unit in 5 years' time.
I think this is just accelerating what was happening anyway. I mean, if COVID hadn't happened, this was going to happen maybe over the next 10 years, and perhaps this has just accelerated everything by 5 years. I think that change in the high street was already upon us and was going to happen anyway. So I think yes, about the question, retailers are likely to have the upper hand in negotiation because it's just a pure question of supply and demand. There's a lot more to supply than there is demand and ability to pay.
Okay. Another question here: is it worth investing in buy-to-let in the current environment? Someone's asked, well, what are your thoughts on the residential property market? Will the prices drop?
I think there's two. I mean, I'd answer that from a tax perspective. That certainly buy-to-let investments isn't a great investment to do these days, especially if you're heavily borrowing to fund a buy-to-let, because the risk is there on the downside. And these days, with the restrictions on finance costs, means that you can quite often pay more tax than you'll earn in rent. As to what might happen to values in the future. Who knows? Yeah, unemployment's bound to cause issues, but then, as it was in the last crisis, there wasn't that many repossessions given the state that the economy was in. And if there aren't repossessions, it's unlikely house prices are going to fall significantly, because sellers tend to get attached to a value of their property and don't tend to want to take any less. So, difficult question. Should you invest in it? But certainly not from a tax perspective, but maybe from an investment portfolio perspective.
Okay. Someone else commented on the earlier question, the answers to that. Bringing housing and distribution to the town centres might reduce the building stock prices. Are we not heading towards decreasing stock value due to low demand for property? Who wants to get their crystal ball out?
That is a crystal ball question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, so similar to the other questions, it's do we expect there to be lower values for land because there's lower demand, and I think there'll be some repositioning of properties. So
yes, I'd agree. Yeah, I agree, Andrew.
Yeah.
I think the demand for land will still be relatively strong, particularly with the density of land use in areas such as Park Royal and Enfield and these large distribution areas of towns, where they've tried to make, I think Enfield is one of the largest distribution zones in the areas in the country, because of its proximity to large consumer chimney pots and large consumer markets. So I don't see too much of a decrease in the value of land in these areas, because of the proximity to a marketplace.
Okay. It would be interesting to hear from all three of you now on from sort of your perspective about the bounce back. We have got one more question. This is pre-submitted. We're hearing a lot of this, but during lockdown, it's become apparent that our team can work really well from home, and we have realised that we do not need 12,000 square feet of city space. What do you suggest we do? Which is similar to some of the previous questions, but I'm sure Michael would love to answer this one.
I reckon that I must be answering that question. As I said earlier, I've become an advisory lawyer. I reckon I answer that at least half a dozen times a week, if not more. So I'm going to say the first thing they've got to do is look at their existing lease, because their existing lease might have a break clause. I always say to clients, please, please, please spend a bit of money on me to serve your break notice, because one of the largest forms of professional property negligence is the misservice of a break clause. Got to get the dates right. Time is of the essence. So it's no good saying, I've got 5.5 months to serve it, but it doesn't really matter. The landlord won't mind if it's a bit late. A shrewd or reasonably bright landlord will say, no, you should have served it 6 months before, if that's what the lease says. Very important to serve a break notice correctly. Negotiate with the landlord. Tell the landlord we cannot afford to pay the rent anymore. The landlord may say, we'll stagger the rent, or we will come to some sort of arrangement. I've got something I was dealing with this morning where the landlord has agreed a small reduction over the next few quarters, but he said, I want you in for another year. So, okay, the client's going to stay until 2026 instead of 2025, but that's the quid pro quo. So there's a lot of that going on. There's a lot of people as well who realise they don't need all the space, because actually we can all work from home, but they want to keep a city presence. And very often there are other floors or other units within their building, and the landlord might sort of do some sort of exchange. But the crucial point is, once you decide it is apparent that you do not need all the space, make sure that you A, look at your lease, and B, that you speak to your landlord, because decent landlords, and make no mistake, there are lots of decent landlords around at the moment, will generally come to some sort of deal. They might cap dilapidations, but they know that it's better to have some money than a tenant going under completely.
There's no, just jumping in here, Michael, if I may, there's no substitute for a tenant having an early discussion with the landlord to keep the landlord on side and to start a dialogue, because a tenant in dialogue with the landlord is likely to have a better outcome and a better relationship with the landlord, and the landlord is more likely to be more favourable and listen, rather than just leaving it and saying, oh, I'm not going to think about it today, I'll leave it till tomorrow. As a tenant saying manana doesn't really work with a landlord. You need to have that dialogue and that constant chatter to make a relationship work, because at the end of the day, it is a relationship, and the better relationships, as we know from business and personal lives, are the ones where there's constant communication.
Yeah.
Okay. So what would be interesting would be to have from each of you, another question that's come in, when will we know the property market has bounced back? What indicators should we be looking at? So from each of your perspectives. So Michael, let's start with you.
Probably when I tell you I can't do this webinar next week, or I can't submit my article for the website because I'm too busy. But joking apart, I don't think we do know. And the shrewder investors are those people who can call the market when it's either at its bottom or its peak. There is never any one indicator. But somehow you get I don't know about you, Phil and Andy, but I've seen the market go up and down over my sort of 30 plus years. And somehow you get a feeling when things are starting to go down or when things are starting to go up. I've always had a very easy rule of thumb that for every transaction I complete, I expect to open a new file to replace it. When I see that I've completed 3 matters in a week, but I've opened 5 new files, I think things are going in the right, the trajectory is going the right way. That's just my rule of thumb, but other people probably have more scientific rules of, not necessarily rules of thumb, scientific formulae.
I think I'd agree with you, Michael. I think from my perspective, when the signs of the recovery and the bounce back will be when social distancing becomes less of an issue, and the people can more freely get out and spend. Okay, people can spend now online, and shops are starting to open slowly now. But I think people can actually go into shops properly without having to think too much about face masks and keeping their distance and touching things that don't need to be quarantined for 72 hours. And people can get into pubs and start spending in pubs properly, and that will be one of the major signs when I think the economy is bouncing back.
Yeah, I think I'd add to that as well, Phil. I think it's when people are spending when they're not afraid for their jobs, and people are feeling that they're secure in their jobs, so they can go out and spend money. I mean, ultimately the economic recovery is going to drive the bounce back, and the economic recovery is going to be driven by consumers getting back out there, spending money in shops, spending money in pubs, restaurants when they reopen. And I think if we get to a point where the consumer is happy to go back out and put money back on their credit cards and spend money, I think that then we'll begin to see the bounce back happen. I think then it will happen quite quickly, because I think it will snowball from there.
Okay, so any final thoughts, gentlemen, before we wrap up?
I'd just like to say thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this and to give me the opportunity to put forward some comments.
Thank you for joining us, and to you, Andy, as well. It's very much appreciated having some
Thank you very much
experts.
for having us.
Yeah, and thank you all for coming along and listening and watching it on one of the websites where it'll be in a couple of days.
Couple of hours, Michael.
Couple
You
of
don't
hours.
hang around. So thank you, all three of you. Thank you to everyone for listening. Those of you that are going back to work, please stay safe. And those of you that are still waiting, hopefully it won't be too long. And we will hopefully see you all again online soon. So thanks everyone for joining us. Take care all. Stay safe.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Right.
Bye.